The constant hum of the cargo ship's engines filled the small cockpit as James checked his navigation charts. His small vessel, the Star Runner, wasn't much to look at, but it had never failed him in 5 years of deep space hauling. The dark emptiness of space stretched before him, broken only by the distant twinkle of stars. The emergency beacon caught him by surprise. A sharp beeping cut through the quiet rhythm of his ship, and the scanner lit up with a distress signal. James leaned forward, his weathered hands moving across the controls as he tracked the source. The signal came from a nearby sector, just off his planned route. "Well, that's not supposed to be there," he muttered, noting the elegant design of the disabled vessel that appeared on his screen. Its sleek silver hull and ornate markings didn't match any regular transport ships he knew. The vessel was clearly damaged, with debris floating around it like a cloud of metallic confetti. James could have ignored it. Most cargo pilots would have. Space was dangerous, and distress calls could be traps. But something about this felt different. The damage patterns weren't consistent with pirate attacks, and the ship's design was too sophisticated for common criminals. He guided the Star Runner closer, using his ship's basic scanners to check for signs of life. The readings showed only one very faint life signal. The ship's hull had multiple breach points, and its life support was failing. "Looks like someone had a really bad day," James said to himself as he carefully aligned his ship with the damaged vessel's airlock. The docking procedure was tricky. The other ship's systems were barely functioning, and he had to manually override several safety protocols. Inside the damaged ship, James moved carefully in his spacesuit. The interior was a mess of twisted metal and broken panels, but the craftsmanship of what remained was impressive. Gold and silver decorations lined the walls, now scared by what looked like weapons fire. He found her in what appeared to be a private chamber. The alien princess lay unconscious, her pale blue skin almost white from oxygen deprivation. Her clothing, though torn and damaged, showed signs of incredible wealth and status. The chamber's emergency shield had protected her from the vacuum of space, but it was failing. James didn't hesitate. He checked her vital signs using his suit's medical scanner. Her biology was different from human, but the basic signs of life seemed similar enough. She was alive, but barely. With careful movements, he lifted her into his arms. She was surprisingly light, probably due to her species' different bone structure. Getting her back to his ship wasn't easy. The damaged vessel's artificial gravity was fluctuating, making each step a challenge. Twice he had to stop and adjust his grip to keep from dropping her as gravity suddenly increased or decreased. Once inside the Star Runner, James quickly set up his ship's small medical bay. He wasn't a doctor, but every cargo pilot knew basic emergency care. The challenge was figuring out how to adapt human medical equipment for an alien patient. "Come on," he whispered, watching the medical scanner's readings stabilize as the emergency oxygen took effect. "Stay with me." Hours passed as James kept watch over his unexpected passenger. He had sent out a coded distress call on frequencies he knew were monitored by her people. The markings on her ship had matched news reports about the stellar empire. The princess's breathing steadied, and color returned to her face. James noticed how her features, though alien, held a certain grace. Her long silver hair seemed to shimmer even under the medical bay's harsh lights. When she finally opened her eyes, they were a stunning shade of violet. She looked at him with a mixture of confusion and wonder, clearly not expecting to see a human face. James gave what he hoped was a reassuring smile. "You're safe now," he said slowly, hoping she could understand him. "I found your ship. Help is on the way." The princess tried to speak, but could only manage a weak nod before drifting back to sleep. James returned to his pilot's seat, knowing that his simple cargo run had just become something much more complicated. He had no idea that this moment would change not only his life, but the future of human-alien relations forever. The arrival of the Imperial fleet was a sight James would never forget. 3 massive warships materialized from hyperspace, their golden hulls gleaming against the darkness of space. His small cargo ship, the Star Runner, looked like a mere speck beside their grandeur. The princess had recovered enough to sit up by then. She watched through the viewport as her people's ships approached, but James noticed her shoulders tense. Something in her expression suggested she wasn't entirely relieved to see them. "Your people are here," James said, noticing how she straightened her torn dress and attempted to arrange her silver hair. Even injured, she carried herself with remarkable dignity. The communication channel crackled to life with a stern voice speaking in the Empire's language. The princess responded quickly, her musical voice carrying authority, despite her weakened state. James didn't understand the words, but their effect was immediate. A transport shuttle departed from the largest warship. When the Imperial Guards boarded his ship, James found himself surrounded by tall, blue-skinned warriors in ornate armor. Their weapons, though holstered, were clearly visible. The leader of the group looked at James with barely concealed disdain. "You will be compensated for your assistance," the guard captain said in accented English. His tone made it sound more like an inconvenience than gratitude. The princess spoke up sharply, her violet eyes flashing. The guard seemed taken aback by her words, but the captain shook his head firmly. James watched this exchange with growing unease, realizing that politics were at play even in this simple rescue. "The princess area of the fourth sun extends her appreciation," the captain translated stiffly. "However, you will not be permitted to accompany us to the Imperial vessel. Such mixing of species is not our way." James nodded, knowing better than to argue. "As long as she's safe," he said simply, looking at the princess. "Arya, one last time." Arya stepped forward, ignoring her guard's attempts to stop her. She removed a delicate crystal pendant from her neck and placed it in James's hand. Her fingers were cool against his skin, and her eyes held a message he couldn't quite read. The guards quickly moved between them, hustling the princess toward the exit. James caught one last glimpse of her looking back at him before the airlock sealed. From his viewport, James watched the shuttle return to the Imperial warship. A junior officer remained behind to handle the compensation, a small case of precious metals that probably cost less than the fuel James had used during the rescue. "The Empire acknowledges your service," the officer said mechanically. "You are instructed to maintain silence regarding this incident. The official record will show that Imperial forces conducted the rescue." James wanted to protest, but years of space trading had taught him when to hold his tongue. He accepted the case with a neutral expression, watching as the last representative of the Empire left his ship. The crystal pendant in his pocket felt heavier than it should. Looking at it under the light, he saw complex patterns that seemed to shift and change. It was clearly more than just jewelry, but its meaning would remain a mystery to him, for now. As the Imperial warships disappeared into hyperspace, James sat in his pilot's chair, thinking about the strange turn of events. He had a feeling that the princess's gratitude and his own role in her rescue wouldn't be so easily erased from history. The Star Runner's engines hummed back to life as he set course for his original destination. James couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. The way the princess had looked at him, the secret gift of the pendant, the obvious tension between her wishes and Imperial protocol, all of it pointed to something larger brewing beneath the surface. "Well," he said to his empty ship, "that's going to make for an interesting log entry." He carefully stored the pendant in his safe, knowing somehow that he should keep it close. The cargo run would continue, but James knew his life had just become considerably more complicated. 5 years passed like stardust through an hourglass. The Imperial Palace's grand halls echoed with Princess Arya's footsteps as she moved between meetings, her traditional robes now worn with practiced grace. She had changed from the injured princess James had rescued, growing into a figure of quiet strength and careful reform. In her private chamber, hidden behind ornate panels of gold and crystal, she kept a secret collection of human cultural data. Books, music, and historical records filled her private computer, each piece carefully gathered through a network of trusted traders. Her particular interest lay in human problem-solving and adaptability, traits her own people often dismissed as primitive. Your Highness, her trusted advisor, Reed, entered with the day's reports. The conservative houses are protesting again. They say your new education policies are too radical. Arya smiled slightly, her violet eyes scanning the latest trade reports from the human sectors. Let them protest. They cannot stop the flow of time forever. She had spent these years building a careful web of influence. Small changes at first, updated emergency protocols for royal ships, reformed trade regulations, cultural exchange programs disguised as security measures. Each move was calculated to slowly wake her people from their technological stagnation. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, James had built a reputation of his own. The Star Runner had been replaced by a larger vessel, the Dawn Trader, and his once small cargo business had grown into a respected merchant operation. He never spoke about his rescue of the princess, honoring the Empire's command for silence, but stories had a way of spreading through space. Arya watched his progress through carefully filtered reports. She saw how he handled diplomatic incidents with a directness that shocked her people's sensibilities but got results. His ships now carried vital trade goods along routes that had been closed for centuries. The High Council requests your presence, Your Highness, Reed announced, interrupting her thoughts. They wish to discuss the recent border incidents with the human territories. Arya stood, smoothing her ceremonial robes. Tell me about these incidents. 3 Imperial patrol ships violated human space while pursuing suspected smugglers. The humans responded with unexpected restraint, but tensions are rising. The princess touched the empty spot on her neck, where her crystal pendant once hung. She had given James more than just jewelry that day. The pendant contained encrypted access codes to Imperial communication channels. She wondered if he had ever discovered its true purpose. In her years of studying humans, she had learned that their greatest strength wasn't their technology or their resources. It was their ability to adapt, to find new solutions to old problems. The Empire, in contrast, had spent centuries perfecting what they already knew, becoming more rigid with each passing generation. The Empire cannot survive without change, she said softly, more to herself than to Reed. And change will not come from within. She made her way to the High Council chamber, her mind working through possibilities. The border incidents weren't accidents. She had arranged them carefully, creating a situation that would force interaction between humans and her people. It was risky, but necessary. As she took her place among the council members, Arya felt the weight of her plans pressing down on her. 5 years of careful preparation, of learning and watching and waiting, were about to bear fruit. The Empire's pride would never allow them to learn from humans willingly, but perhaps a crisis would open their eyes. We must address the human question, the High Chancellor announced, his tone heavy with traditional ceremony. Arya straightened in her seat, her expression carefully neutral. Everything was falling into place. Soon, she would see James again, not as a rescued princess, but as an architect of change. The bold declaration she had spent years preparing would shake the foundations of both their civilizations. Yes, she agreed, her voice clear and strong. Let us discuss the humans. The diplomatic chamber aboard the neutral space station hummed with tension. James stood at the viewport, watching his ship, the Dawn Trader, float alongside the gleaming Imperial vessels. 5 years of building his trading empire had taught him to handle delicate situations, but this was different. The message that had brought him here was encoded in the crystal pendant he'd nearly forgotten about, the one the princess had given him years ago. It had suddenly activated during the border crisis, revealing its true nature as a sophisticated communication device. Captain James of the merchant fleet announced a stern-faced Imperial guard. Her Royal Highness will see you now. He followed the guard through ornate corridors, noting how the other diplomats whispered as he passed. His simple but well-made captain's uniform stood out among their elaborate robes and ceremonial armor. The door slid open, and there she was. Princess Arya stood by a holographic display of contested space territories, her silver hair now worn in intricate braids that marked her elevated status. She turned, and their eyes met. "It seems I still owe you a proper thank you," she said, her voice carrying the same musical quality he remembered, though now tinged with authority. James bowed slightly, remembering the protocol he'd studied. "Your Highness, I hope the years have been kind to you. They have been educational." She dismissed the guards with a gesture. Once they were alone, her formal posture relaxed slightly. "I've watched your progress, James. You've built quite a name for yourself." "You've been busy yourself," he replied, gesturing to the holographic display. "These border incidents, they're not accidents, are they?" Arya smiled, and for a moment he saw the same wonder in her eyes that he'd witnessed when she first woke up in his medical bay years ago. "You always were direct." "No, they're not accidents. I needed a crisis that would force both sides to talk." "That's dangerous game," James said, moving closer to examine the display. "People could die if this escalates." "People will die if nothing changes," she countered. "My empire is dying, James. We're so wrapped up in tradition that we can't see our own stagnation. But humans, you adapt, you change, you find new ways forward." James studied her face, seeing the weight of responsibility in her expression. "And what do you want from me?" "I want your help," she said simply. "The conservative houses would rather go to war than admit they need to change. But you're respected in both human space and parts of the empire. Your voice carries weight." A soft chime interrupted them. The holographic display shifted to show new diplomatic messages arriving from both sides. Threats, demands, and posturing from imperial houses, mixed with cautious warnings from human admirals. "The Empire's pride will destroy us," Arya said softly, "unless we can show them another way." She turned to face him fully. "Do you remember when you found me? You didn't hesitate to help, despite our differences. That's what we need now. That human ability to see past ancient barriers." James touched the crystal pendant in his pocket. "You've been planning this for a long time, haven't you?" 5 years, she admitted. "Every reform, every trade agreement, every small step forward, it was all leading to this moment. But I need your help for what comes next." "And what comes next?" he asked, though something in her expression told him he might not be ready for the answer. Arya's violet eyes held a mixture of determination and something else, something that made his heart beat faster. "Tomorrow, I make an announcement that will either save my people or tear the Empire apart. And you, James, are at the center of it." He should have felt manipulated, used as a piece in her political game. Instead, he felt the same thing he'd felt 5 years ago, that this moment was bigger than both of them. "Well," he said with a slight smile, "at least this time you're conscious for the rescue." The Grand Assembly Hall of the neutral space station buzzed with activity. Representatives from the Empire's noble houses filled one side, their elaborate robes creating a sea of shimmering colors. On the other side sat the human delegation, their uniforms practical but dignified. The tension between the two groups was almost visible in the air. James stood near the human delegation, his merchant captain's insignia drawing curious glances from both sides. The last day had been a blur of diplomatic meetings and careful preparations, but Arya had kept her final plan secret from everyone, including him. The announcement system chimed, and Princess Arya entered the hall. Her ceremonial robes flowed around her like liquid starlight, but it was her expression that caught everyone's attention. She carried herself with absolute certainty, her violet eyes clear and focused. "Noble houses of the Empire, honored representatives of humanity," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "We stand at a crossroads. Our recent conflicts have brought us to the edge of war, but they have also brought us an opportunity." The imperial nobles murmured among themselves. This wasn't the typical opening to a diplomatic session. James noticed several of the older house's representatives shifting uncomfortably. 5 years ago, Arya continued, when assassins destroyed my ship and nearly took my life, it was not an imperial rescue fleet that saved me. It was a human merchant captain, acting alone, who risked everything to help a stranger in need. The murmurs grew louder. This story had been officially suppressed, though rumors had circulated for years. James felt dozens of eyes turn toward him. "Captain James," she said, turning to face him, "please step forward." He moved to the center of the hall, standing before both delegations. Arya descended from her platform until they stood on the same level, a breach of protocol that caused gasps among the imperial nobles. "Our empire's laws speak of life debts and sacred obligations," she declared. "They tell us that when one's life is saved, a bond is formed that transcends all other considerations." She paused, her next words falling into complete silence. "I stand before the human who once saved me, and I make this declaration. I choose him as my consort." The hall erupted in chaos. Imperial nobles leaped to their feet, shouting about tradition and contamination of the royal bloodline. Human delegates stared in shock, their diplomatic training failing them in the face of this unprecedented announcement. "This is outrageous." The head of House Eternal rose, his face flushed dark blue with anger. "The royal line cannot be joined with a human. Our laws are clear." Arya's voice cut through the noise. "A life debt of the royal family can only be repaid through service or union. I choose union." James stood perfectly still, his mind racing. This was her plan, to force change not through politics or war, but through a personal declaration that couldn't be ignored without undermining the Empire's most sacred laws. "The human has not accepted," another noble called out desperately. Arya turned to James, and in her eyes he saw both the determined princess and the young woman he'd rescued among the stars. "Captain James," she said formally, "will you accept this declaration?" A hall fell silent again. James looked at her, understanding flowing between them. This wasn't just about them. It was about building a bridge between two civilizations, about forcing change through connection rather than conflict. "Yes," he said simply, his voice strong and clear. "I accept." The chaos that followed was like a storm breaking. Some nobles stormed out in protest, others began citing ancient laws and precedents. The human delegates huddled in urgent discussion, trying to understand the diplomatic implications. But Arya and James stood in the center of it all, calm in the eye of the storm they'd created. Her hand found his, cool fingers interlacing with warm ones, a physical symbol of the bridge they were building between their peoples. "Well," James said quietly, so only she could hear, "that's one way to start a diplomatic crisis." "No," Arya replied with a slight smile. "That's how we end one." The Imperial Gardens aboard the space station filled with the soft glow of artificial sunlight. James dodged another energy blast, rolling behind a decorative pillar as his opponent, Lord Vex of House Eternal, advanced with lethal grace. "You dishonor our traditions by even participating in this challenge," Vex snarled, his ceremonial armor gleaming as he raised his weapon again. James didn't waste breath responding. 3 days had passed since Arya's declaration, and the conservative houses had demanded he prove his worth through the ancient trials of valor. What they hadn't expected was for him to accept immediately. "The human shows some skill," one of the noble observers commented as James ducked another shot and closed the distance to Vex. "But skill alone does not make one worthy of the royal line." In the observation gallery, Arya watched with outward calm, though her hands gripped the railing tightly. This was the third trial today. James had already passed tests of wisdom and strategy, surprising the imperial judges with solutions they hadn't considered possible. James moved in close, forcing Vex to switch to hand-to-hand combat. The noble's superior strength met James's practical experience in zero-gravity fights. They grappled, spinning through the garden's artificial gravity field. "Your Highness," Reed whispered to Arya, "the second assassination attempt was thwarted. The culprits had imperial security codes." Arya nodded slightly, never taking her eyes off the combat below. House Eternal grows desperate. They fear change more than death. James locked Vex's arm and used the noble's own momentum to throw him. The move, learned in countless spaceport brawls, sent Vex crashing into a fountain. Water droplets floated in the fluctuating gravity field like crystal beads. "Enough," Vex roared, abandoning ceremony and drawing a hidden blade. "I will not let some human merchant destroy thousands of years of pure bloodlines." The observers gasped at this breach of the trial's rules, but before they could intervene, James had already moved. Years of dealing with pirates and raiders had taught him to expect treachery. He caught Vex's wrist, twisted, and in one smooth motion disarmed him. "The trial is concluded," announced the chief judge, his tone carrying both relief and surprise. "The human has proven his worth in combat, as he did in wisdom and strategy." Vex struggled to his feet, his pride wounded more than his body. "This proves nothing. He cannot understand our ways, our history." "Actually," James interrupted, speaking for the first time since the trial began, "I spent the last 5 years studying imperial history. Your traditions speak of adaptation, of taking strength where it's found. Your first emperor was a common soldier who saved his predecessor's life, much like how I saved Aria's." A murmur of surprise ran through the observers. Even Aria raised an eyebrow, though a small smile played at her lips. "You dare speak her name so familiarly?" Vex sputtered. "I dare to honor your traditions by learning them," James replied calmly. "Something you might consider doing yourself, instead of just hiding behind them." The chief judge raised his hands for silence. "The trials of valor are complete. Captain James has proven himself worthy by ancient law and modern deed. Let it be recorded." A sharp crack interrupted him as a laser bolt seared through the air, where James had been standing a moment before. He had already moved, pulling Aria's gift, the crystal pendant, from his neck and throwing it toward the hidden assassin. The pendant exploded in a flash of stunning energy, revealing a cloaked figure who collapsed unconscious. "House Eternal grows more predictable in their desperation," Aria commented dryly as security forces swarmed the area. "Though I will miss that pendant." James straightened his trial armor, now scored with blast marks and water stains. "I'm starting to think they don't like me very much." The observers, despite themselves, laughed at this typical human understatement. Even some of the more moderate nobles were beginning to see why Aria had chosen this particular human. "The trials continue," she said softly, "but not just for you. Our entire empire is being tested now." James nodded, understanding. Each challenge they faced was another step toward changing an ancient civilization, one tradition at a time. The imperial palace's grand ceremonial hall sparkled with light from 1,000 floating crystals. 2 years had passed since the declaration that shook the empire, and today marked the culmination of that bold choice. James stood beside Aria at the great window, both of them watching ships from across the galaxy arrive for the celebration. "Remember when you used to fly that tiny cargo ship?" Aria asked, her violet eyes twinkling with amusement as they watched a human Imperial Joint Patrol cruise past. "The Star Runner," James smiled, adjusting his formal robes, still simpler than traditional Imperial wear, but elegant in their own way. "Never thought it would lead to all this." Below them, in the palace's public squares, humans and Imperials mingled freely. Young nobles studied alongside human students, sharing knowledge and ideas that had been locked away for centuries. Trade ships from both civilizations docked side by side at the orbital stations, their crews exchanging not just goods but stories and innovations. "House Eternal's representatives have finally agreed to join the new council," Reed announced, approaching with a data tablet. "They're still grumbling, but they can't deny the results anymore." Aria nodded, satisfied. The Empire's technological advancement in the past 2 years had exceeded the previous century's progress. Human adaptability combined with imperial precision had created breakthroughs that neither civilization could have achieved alone. "Your Highness," a young Imperial guard called out, using the new simplified protocols that had replaced hours of formal ceremony. "The delegation from Earth has arrived." James watched as human diplomats entered the hall, remembering his first awkward encounters with Imperial protocol. Now both sides had learned to blend their customs, creating something new and stronger than either tradition alone. "Tell me again about the moment you decided," James said softly to Arya as they prepared to greet the delegates. "When did you know this was the right path?" Arya's hand found his, their different skin temperatures long since familiar to both. "When you saved me, you didn't see a princess or an alien. You saw someone who needed help. That's when I realized our empire needed to learn that same lesson." The celebration began as the sun set, casting the crystal city in shades of purple and gold. Stories were shared in both languages, tales of the rescue, the declaration, the trials, and the changes that followed. Young imperial children played with human toys while their parents discussed joint ventures with Earth's merchants. "They're calling it the New Renaissance," Reed reported, showing them the latest cultural impact studies. "Both civilizations are growing faster together than anyone predicted." James watched a group of imperial scientists demonstrating their latest invention, a healing technology that combined human medical knowledge with imperial energy manipulation, all because you gave them permission to change. "No," Arya corrected him gently, "because you showed them why they should." As night fell, the crystal lights brightened, and the formal ceremonies began. But these were new ceremonies, created to honor both cultures. The ancient imperial songs now carried hints of human melodies, while Earth's traditional dances had adopted the graceful movements of imperial art. "A message from the outer colonies," Reed announced. "The Joint Exploration Fleet has discovered a new world. They're requesting permission to name it New Beginning." James and Arya shared a knowing look. The name was almost too obvious, but it felt right. Their union had created more than just political alliance. It had sparked a renaissance of culture, technology, and hope. "Permission granted," Arya said, then turned to address the gathered crowd. Her voice carried across the hall, strong and clear. "Let it stand as a symbol of what we can achieve together." The celebration continued into the night, but James and Arya slipped away to their private garden. Here, among the flowers from both worlds growing together in impossible but beautiful combinations, they could simply be themselves. "Was it worth all the risk?" James asked, though he already knew the answer. Arya looked up at the stars, the same stars that had brought them together. "Some risks change everything," she said, "and some changes last forever." Above them, human and imperial ships danced through space, their lights tracing patterns of harmony against the eternal dark. The princess who had once stood before a human and made a bold declaration had done more than save her people. She had shown them how to grow.